All right, so this is where it started for the highway scene. And so looking through my saves in my project directory, um, I started in my kit of parts project, meaning where I just save random elements that I might reuse in other projects like trees or plants. And so the name of this scene is just onyx trees underscore B. And this is save O2. And the only difference between O1 and O2 is I've shown you this is the one where I actually named all of these groups. So basically, this highway scene or project evolved out of me just exporting a bunch of trees from Onyx into Maya, setting up their shaders, just like we did together, and then deciding that it would be fun to just build a little scene for them on the fly. So I didn't really know where I was going with it. It was just kind of something that was made for fun. And so this scene we've already talked about, as far as physical sun, physical sky, exposure photographic node, all MIA materials, and that's pretty much it. And so if I go into Hypershade, the shaders on these didn't change that much once I started building the highway from what I built in just this scene. So if we take a look, we can see that I've got 3 or 4 different bark shaders. And for each one, I'm piping the color through a remap node so that I get a grayscale version where I use a ramp to modify the contrast, and I pump that into bump as well as spec or reflection color. And so we can see I've got 4 different shaders that are sort of randomly assigned to my different trees. Then we can see I have a few different leaf textures. And so in here, what we can see, if we take a look at some of them, is it's just like what we've talked about, where I've got color, bump. This one we can see we have front color, back color, translucency, bump. This one doesn't have spec, although generally they look better if they do. And then this is a leaf that's not a 3x3. It's just a single leaf. So you can see on the placements node, I just repeated it, 3x3. But then to break up the color a little bit on this leaf, so they're not all exactly the same, I just have this file I created in Photoshop, which is just, a grid where I'm piping this texture, this file texture, into the color gain on my file textures. And remember, color gain, which is under color balance, is a multiplier. And so if this was all white, meaning a value of 1, and it's a multiplier, it wouldn't change the image at all. And so I have, 3 squares that are white, so they're not going to change the leaf. And then I have some that are different shades of yellow and orange, and we can see the result. So it just gives me some variation, even if I only have a single leaf texture. It just allows me to break it up a little bit. So that's what's going on with this shader. So this one is also something that's a texture that I repeat 3x3, although this one I didn't add any variation, but we can see this one does have a spec map or a reflection color map. This is a different leaf, so this one, if we go in, we can see what that leaf looks like. And I did choose to break this one up with that same texture. And the settings on these leaves, you can see glossiness 0.3, transparency 0.25, ambient occlusion on, BRDF 0.1 and 1, so they're more reflective at a glancing angle. So just the basic settings that I showed you. This one, same kind of thing. And this one is an oak leaf. And so we can go inside here and see what this is looking like. So nothing fancy at all. This one does have a transparency map, meaning a map that has the veins of the leaf. And that is going into the refraction color. So specifically under refraction, right above transparency, this is usually white, but you can texture map it with something that has the veins in the leaf. And so since I had that sitting around for this texture, I used it. So those are my shaders. So it's really simple. So even though I cruised through it, I think really the main thing that takes time here is not building the shader. Building the shader takes a minute or two once you're used to it and you've done it a bunch of times. The time comes from having all of these file textures. And so if I jump to Photoshop for a second, and let's go to my maps directory. Oops, don't go there. E, maps, leaf scans. So, so like I've mentioned, this is where the time comes, is like eventually just building this library of textures. Some are 3 by 3, some aren't. So like this is a leaf that I scanned. And so you can see I've got the front color and the back color. So I just went outside and grabbed this, really cool looking leaf, scanned it and made the texture. And so if I go in and open my raw scan, so we can see that's this one right here, then obviously to get it prepped to be a texture, and then also I've got the back of it that I scanned. So select all, copy, close, paste, and then since it's the back, I have to flip it horizontally and then lower the transparency on it, and then I can go in and basically line them up. So if I get the tip right there to kind of line up, I can drag that little point, which is the rotation pivot, to try and kind of get things to line up a little better. So I can see that it's lining up really well on the left, but on the right, not so great, because when I flip the leaf over, the leaf kind of moved a little bit. So when that happens, you can just go ahead and use the liquify tool. So if I go to the liquify tool, and let's go and shrink this down a little bit. The liquify tool is obviously super useful. And then with the liquify tool, obviously I can go and say, well, use background. So show backdrop, use the background. So now I can just see how I'm scooting this to line up better. So I don't need it to get it perfect, because that would be a waste of time. You're just trying to get it pretty close. And once you've got it close enough so that they line up, then I can go and crop in a little bit. And so you can see now these pretty much line up. And then in here, let me turn this into a layer. Obviously I need to go and select. So quick selection tool. It's pretty easy. I can just go and start selecting white areas and shift clicking inside here to grab those areas. And so that's kind of like a lazy way to select stuff, because you're not really trying to be totally perfect. I'm just going in and grabbing what I can. But now that I've done that, I can select inverse and then go to select, modify, contract, and then just contract that in maybe a couple pixels. It shrinks the selection down. And then select inverse and then delete. And now I've got that leaf. So if I make a new layer underneath it, and I eyedrop one of these green colors, then I can see what I need to still clean up, but it's still pretty good. So I can now go in here and, I could obviously just go with a hard edge eraser and just erase out what's not needed inside here, like so. And like nobody's going to know if you're like totally perfect with this. So that's why it goes kind of quick. So I'm kind of getting it, but I'm using a mouse right now. So in there, so once you have that pretty good, then I got to do the same thing on this one. And so on this one, I'm going to set the opacity back to 100, quick select. So we did this on, another DVD, but it's always good to review. So I'm doing the same thing in here. So just trying to get relatively decent selection. I wasn't expecting that I was going to do this demo right now, but it's useful. So I've got that. So select inverse, select modify, contract, and then select inverse and delete. So now I got that. And then we hide what's behind it, and then make a new layer. And then I drop a color, and then fill that. All right, this one turned out pretty good. And then eraser tool on this layer, and just erase out some of the white junk. And then the edges of this leaf and the other leaf are not going to be totally in sync with each other, so that's the next thing that we would have to fix. So, all right, so once I've got this, so what I need to do is you can see that there's a discrepancy. So what I do is I take this layer, right-click, select pixels, then go to this layer, select inverse, and delete. Then select this layer, select pixels, grab this layer, select inverse, and delete. And so that just causes their edges to be totally in sync with each other. So it's kind of a cool trick. And then they're almost ready. So what I then do as my last step is I'll take this leaf and I'll duplicate it, and I'll take the one underneath and I'll blur it with a Gaussian blur, a little bit more than that, like so. And then do the same thing with this leaf, duplicate it, take the one underneath, apply the same blur. And then I'll go to the one that's blurred and go to the smudge tool, and I'll basically go in and extend the edges out a little bit. So of course I picked a leaf that's got a million fingers on it. But this is something that you can be relatively lazy about. It's just you're trying to avoid getting a fringe on your leaf edges. So that's what I'm doing with this. And I can also just make a brush with a soft edge and just do some of it manually so the color is kind of similar to what's near that area, which for this leaf is kind of needed. And then once I've done that, what I would do is on this top leaf, I will select its pixels, which has a nice hard edge to it. I will save that selection as my alpha channel, because that's what I need for my cutout opacity on my shader. So now I have this nice alpha channel, which is going to work for both the front and the back of the leaf. And then I will load that selection. I will shrink it, modify, contract by maybe 3 pixels. And then I will blur the selection, modify feather by 3 pixels. And then I will select inverse and hit delete. And so you can see that I now have this soft edge where it's bleeding into the color behind it. And if I were to load my selection right now, again, my alpha channel, you can see that I have a nice hard edge alpha channel, but the color is just bleeding at the edges out a little. So I would do the same thing here. So I would load selection, but it's going to be the same alpha channel because they have the same outline. I would contract it by 3 pixels, and then I will feather it by the same amount, and then select inverse and delete. And there you go. So now what I've got, and then in here for the background color that I'm using, I think maybe I'll grab a different green, more similar. And then this gets merged down, and this guy merged down, and there you go. I've got front color, and I've got back color. And that's my process for getting leaf scans ready. So it goes fairly fast, front and back. And then of course I'd need to create bump and speck and that kind of stuff. And so if I duplicate the front, and he'll get rid of the saturation with the hue saturation tool, and then go to the levels tool and hit auto. Then for the bump on the front, I'd probably invert that. And this is going to be my front bump. And then I can duplicate that, go to the levels tool, and then just bring the white point up, and that'll be my speck map. Because your speck, you want to be pretty close to white. And this would be front speck. And then obviously this gives me a good start point for making the vein map. But the vein map, usually I use my Wacom tablet and just draw on top of this, or draw the lines on top, because you can try and adjust levels on this all you want, but you're not going to be able to get just the veins. You know, I mean, you can kind of get there, but it's going to then get really crunchy and you're going to have all this dirt to pick up or clean up. So it's better to just go in there and make a new layer and go in here and like literally draw them, you know, and for that I'd have to go and grab my pen, but you know, it's like, you know, and do that for the rest of them. Okay, so basically that's in here. Front color, front bump, front speck, back color, and then back bump, back speck. And then for this leaf, I'd probably end up using the back color as the translucency map. And so it's a lighter green and it'll work pretty well. If I don't have a back scan, then I'll just take the front color and I can call it, you know, front SSS, even though it's not using an SSS shader. And then I can go in here to the HSV tool and lighten it and increase the saturation a little bit and maybe make it a little bit more yellow. So you can see that that'll now work as a nice translucency map. So again, I just upped the lightness, upped the saturation, and adjusted the hue a little. So that's my process for creating textures for leaves. So if we go inside here, you can see that I've done that for a few. Now some things like, you know, grass or things where the shape of the leaf is already in the geometry and you don't need a alpha channel, you know, that's what these are. So like this is good for spider plants and this is good for spider plants too. And then, you know, for grass, I've got these kind of shaders. You can see that I've got my avocado leaves that I've shown you. So, you know, like the process of scanning the front of the leaf for 9 leaves and then the back of the leaf for 9 leaves and lining them all up and making the maps, it's tedious, but it's a very important thing. So I've debated whether I would include some of this stuff on the DVD or on these DVDs, and I decided not to just because I figured, you know, it's the whole like, you know, you can lead a person to water, but, you know, teach them to fish, whatever that story is. It's better for you to know how to make these yourself than to, you know, worry about using mine. Because you can see here, I scanned 2 avocado leaves are really big. So I scanned 2 from the front, 2 from the back, another 2 from the front, another 2 from the back, another 2 from the front, another 2 from the back, and then just line them all up to make a 3x3. CG Textures, like I've mentioned, is an awesome website. I recommend having a membership to that. And so like on their site, they had the front of a birch leaf or birch looking leaf, and they had the back of it too. They weren't lined up though. So I'd line them up and make all the other different maps. For fig, same thing. You can see I made a map where it says I only have 1 leaf texture, but here I made a texture where they're all different sizes. That's kind of a useful thing to do too, just so you can break up the leaf size. For maple, you can see I was able to get all of these different scans off CG Textures, which was awesome, but I had to go through and create the alpha channels, and although this maybe had an alpha channel already. Some of them do, some of them don't. And then create all my different maps. And then I do have some leaf textures from other libraries like Total Textures and Marlin. I don't use them at all though. So I put them in here just, because when assembling this, that's one of the first places I went was looked at texture libraries I already had to see if there's anything useful. But the Marlin ones you can see are kind of, I don't really understand these. And these in the end I found better, higher res maple textures at CG Textures. So I did go and make one, but I don't really use it. And then Total Textures really doesn't have a lot of leaves, even though they have a bunch of libraries. So these are okay, I guess. But really, you're going to want to, the best thing you can do is walk around the block or go to the park with a paper bag and just grab a bunch of leaves and spend a couple days scanning and organizing. You'll really benefit from that. So that's a quick review on generating the textures. So if I was done in Photoshop now and I needed to export these, I would then just go to Front Color and then just go to Save As, and then I would choose As a Copy, Flatten. If you turn layers off when you save, then it flattens the image. And then I'm going to include the alpha channel because for this leaf underscore front color, I always put the alpha channel in the front color. I don't put it on all of them because it's not necessary. And so that just gives me consistency when I build my shaders. So I always put the alpha channel for the cutout opacity as the alpha on my front color. So I would have as a copy, alpha channel, layers off, it flattens the image, save, and now I have that saved out. Then I would go to the next one, let's say front bump, save as a copy, but then turn these off. Doesn't need the alpha channel, and I need to flatten it. And then this would be my front bump for this leaf. Alrighty, so that's making leaf textures. So since we talked about all the shader setup, I thought even though we've done it before on other DVDs, I think it's a useful review. So now that hopefully you're clear on where all my leaf textures come from, we can get back to our highway scene. So I have this scene, Onyx Trees B02, and so let's move on to Onyx Trees B03 and see what changed. And so I'm going to let that load. So you can see it's the same shaders, but now I've built this geometry. And so in here I don't have the highway yet, and so I didn't even necessarily know I was going to make one at this point. And so I just have, let me increase my clipping plane. As I've mentioned many times, I'm working at real world scale, and so my scenes are very large, but it works just fine. So I've got this terrain. This big cube in here is a volume primitive for fog, but we'll talk about that later. So I've got this geometry, and it's emitting particles. And so if I go to this view, we'll start taking a look at that stuff, but let's pause for a second and continue in the next chapter.